Welcome back to Fix This Build That. I'm Brad, and today we're going to be making a DIY loft bed for less than 75 bucks worth of lumber. A portion of this video is sponsored by Squarespace. This bed can be made for about $75 worth of construction grade 2x4's and 2x6's. But I actually bought 2x12's so I could rip them down into my own 2x6's and 2x4's. Now you can get 3 2x4's or 2 2x6's from one 2x12, and the cost is actually cheaper buying them this way. You can get the same material for about 60 bucks versus 75. And the wood has way fewer knots for cleaner boards to boot, though it can have some challenges. I'll talk about that later. But don't worry, you can just buy 2x6's or 2x4's straight off the rack if you aren't a glutton for punishment like me. I started off by cutting some of the boards right down the middle, and this put me a hair over 5.5 inches wide, which is the same size as a 2x6. And when I started cutting the next board, I ran into my first problem child. Now, the board started binding as it went through the saw, so I immediately shut it off to see what was going on. I looked at the back side of the board, and it was pinching together and squeezing my riving knife, and this caused the stalling. So I grabbed a wooden shim and I hammered it into the kerf to open it back up, and I was able to finish the cut. And when cut in half, the tension in a board can release, and the edge ends up looking more like a banana than a straight line. Now, boards with the pith, or the center of the tree in them, tend to have more tension, and this one did. So try to avoid those if at all possible. I flipped the freshly cut 2x6's over, and I ripped off the rounded edge from the other side. Now, each leg assembly is a 2x6 glued at 90 degrees to a 2x4. So next I cut the 2x4's, which went a lot smoother. I took the leg parts to the miter saw, and I cut one end square, and I flipped them over and cut the other to final size. And one last step that is totally optional, but it gives a much better look, is to run the boards through a planer. And it takes off the top layer of wood, and it gives it a fresh, clean look versus the offcut, like you're seeing here from the original piece. But you could also just sand it down to fresh wood if you don't have a planer. I'm gluing up the legs in the 90-degree layout I mentioned, and using biscuits to help with the alignment. You could also use pocket hole joinery here for a quicker solution. I marked several lines across the edge of the boards for reference marks, and then I cut mating biscuit slots into each board. Now these biscuits really help with boards that need a little persuasion, like some of these ones that bananaed on me. I put glue on the edges, and I used the biscuits to help me line everything up. Now some of these boards didn't quite want to go, but those biscuits really did help out. All I had to do was clamp them together until I saw some good glue squeeze out, which meant I had a tight joint. I did this for all the legs, and then I set them aside to dry overnight while I dreamed about pre-dimensioned wood with no knots or twists. That's because that's the only place they exist, is in my dreams. Now the next day, I came back and I cleaned up the glue joints on the legs. Some of the gaps were small, and I could knock them down with a card scraper or a sander, but some of them were a lot bigger, and so I had to use a block plane, and this made for quick removal. Now, this loft bed's for my middle son, who's been wanting it ever since I made a day bed for his sister. And I know him and his sister and his older brother are going to be climbing all over it, so I wanted to put a heavy roundover on every part. I used a 1/4-inch roundover bit in my handheld router, and I hit all the edges of the legs. Now you can really see how knot-free the leg assemblies are, and how hard that would be to find if you're buying traditional 2x4's and 2x6's. But on that note, I want to jump in here and make sure you understand something. These 2x12's can give you some really awesome lumber. They can also be a huge pain in the butt to work with. So keep that in mind. If you can get nice looking 2x4's or 2x6's that are already there, it's going to be a lot less just hassle, and you're going to not have to worry about if the boards are going to go wonky once you start cutting them. But if you want to put in the time and know it's going to take a little bit more effort, the 2x12's are a great way to go. Just want to throw that out there because it's not all peas and carrots. Peas and carrots? Sprinkles and cupcakes? I don't know. It's not all good. So anyway, let's get back to milling. And next up, I cut the parts for the bed frame from 2x6's, and I went ahead and cut all the rest of the 2x4 parts I needed as well. I took them through the same milling steps as before, hitting the table saw and then the planer before going on to the miter saw to cut the parts to length. Now the bed we're using is a twin size bed, so I cut the 2x6's for the bed frame to fit that size. Now you may want to check the dimensions of your specific bed because the width on twin beds can vary a little bit from what I've noticed from different mattresses. I drilled pocket holes in the short boards using my K4 for quick, strong assembly, and the holes are going to be hidden here when the mattress is inside. And one thing I learned quickly is you really need a lot of space to make this project. We've got long boards and the assemblies are huge. Now luckily I have a mobile workbench and tools that I can move out of the way and get some clear space. I used a right angle clamp to help hold the 2x6s at 90 degrees, and I attached them together with 2.5-inch pocket screws. On the far end, I used a long clamp to hold the pieces together on the bottom as well, and this made for a secure joint that went together nicely. And then I broke out the router again and rounded all the edges on the frame there. It was nice and easy because I could just spin around and hit everything all from that one spot. After that, I cut a couple 2x2's to length to fit on the inside of the bed frame, and these are going to hold the slats for the mattress later on. Now the shorter 2x2's are going to go on the ends of the bed to join the legs and act as a ladder. I stacked them up on my miter saw stand and I squared one end first. Then I decided to flip the stack around and play an impromptu game of Jenga and lose. And if you like laughing at your errors or just laughing at mine, go ahead and get subscribed. I got a little smarter with the long stretchers for the bed and just kept them on my bench and cut them one at a time until I had all my parts ready. And instead of hand routing every one of these pieces, I hit the easy button and busted out my router table. I put a round over on the edges and the ends of all these boards, but if you're using stock 2x4's, you've already got those round overs along the edges. All you'll need to do is a little bit of sanding. I decided to go ahead and paint all my parts at this point. I don't have any joinery to work around right now, and rolling on the paint goes fast and easy. My wife and I put on a coat of primer and 2 coats of painter's tape blue. That's not really the real color, but it looks really like it. And either way, my son loves it, and that's all that matters, even though if it is a bit garish. Okay, we have everything painted at this point, but it is everywhere. So I'm gonna assemble these things, and I'm gonna assemble the ends as well as put the slat holders there on the frame. Then we'll go upstairs and start the final assembly. And while I start assembly here, let's talk about the sponsor of this portion of the video, Squarespace. Now, I've got to admit, I've not done a good job telling you guys about the merch that I have, like my hats and t-shirts and stickers on my website, mainly because I didn't love the shopping experience on my site. But those days are over. I just got done launching a new site on Squarespace. The setup was quick and easy, and they have beautiful and clean templates. You can also get a domain with free Whois privacy protection from Squarespace, or bring your own like I did. I'm using Squarespace for e-commerce, and the product setup, inventory management, and payment processing were all set up in under an hour. And now I have the super clean checkout experience that I've been looking for. Squarespace also has easy to understand analytics to help you know what's working and what's not. They've also got integrated email campaigns that let you stand out in any inbox, and 24/7 email support if you ever need their help. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, you can use code FIXTHIS to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this portion of the video. Now let's get back to the build. After adding small 2x2 cleats on the inside of the legs to register the bed frame, I started assembling the headboard end. This one goes pretty quick and easy since the rails are on the inside of the legs. I clamped down a level to my outfeed table, and I used it to register the feet flush against. Now then I squared up the legs, making the adjustments at the top as I needed. And I also put the top rail in place unattached to make sure I would keep the right spacing from the top to the bottom on this assembly. That's really important so that the bed frame will fit. Now 2.5-inch deck screws are used for all the connections here, and I started off just using the self-tapping feature, but I later switched to pilot holes for a little bit more consistency. The top 2 rails get screwed down, and this end assembly is done in a snap. Now the footboard end, on the other hand, was a little more time consuming because I wanted the rails on the outside of the legs with no screws showing. Now this makes the ladder easier to climb, and I think it just looks better, especially with all that work that I did rounding over those pieces. I raised the legs up off the table with some spacers, and then I put the lower ladder rail in place, using another rail on the inside to match that bed frame width like before. Now to help place the screws from the backside, I whipped up a quick little drill guide from a scrap of 1/2-inch plywood. I cut it to 3/4 inch square, and then I drilled 4 holes in it, spaced an inch from each edge. This let me quickly lay the jig down on the leg and pre-drill some pilot holes. I attached the lower rail on each side, and then I decided it's going to be a lot easier to do this thing standing upright. It might not have looked it, but that last part took me way too long to align and figure out being upside down and stretched across 2 work tables that weren't exactly the same height. So standing it up with a rail clamped in place on top made assembly much easier here. I cut a few small scraps to give me even spacing between each of the rails, and I worked my way up, assembling the foot end. And the process I was repeating here was put the spacers in place, position and center the rail, clamp it tight, drill some pilot holes, and then attach it with screws and repeat. Now you'll notice I put a piece of 3/4 inch MDF on the ground, and that's to try to level out any unevenness in my garage floor so it doesn't translate up while I'm attaching the screws. And be careful when you're working with this end standing upright. I almost toppled the entire thing over a few times before wising up and putting some clamps around the feet for stability. This did a great job of at least stabilizing it to the point where it wouldn't easily fall over, but an extra hand here would also be really helpful. Now the last piece that I added was a filler strip. It goes between the legs flush with that top rail. This eliminates a gap that would be there between the bed frame and that top rung, and that's really good because if that gap was there, it could be a real foot grabber. If you want to build your own loft bed, I do have plans available for this build. There's a link down below in the description. You can go check it out. Now with the major parts done, we are ready to take it up to my son's room for final assembly. And this is definitely a two-person job unless you want to rig up a bunch of supports. Now we put the headboard in against the wall and then brought in the bed frame and rested on the little cleats. These little cleats were a tip that I saw from Jay Bates' bunk bed video, and it really worked like a charm. After clamping the frame to the headboard, we brought in the footboard and fit it in place as well to square everything up. And on a side note, I did space the legs slightly wider than the bed frame just to make sure it would fit with no issues. I used a carpenter square to make sure everything looked good. I secured the frame to the ends with 6 screws into the corner with 3 screws on each portion of the leg. The kids were really dying to see what was going on and how it was coming together, so they sent a spy to check it out. I see you. I used the drill guide I'd made earlier to pre-drill the long guardrails and attach one on the base to shore everything up first before going up top. The other 4 went above the bed frame with 2 on each side. On the headboard side for these long rails, I only used 2 screws, since there's less room as that top rail is on the inside. But in general, I overkilled this thing with screws. It is really stout, so that's not going to be a problem. Now for the slats, I cut down some 1x4 furring strips and I laid them in place across the bed frame. You could also use a sheet of plywood for some mattresses. Just check the manufacturer's website for their recommendation. And we put the mattress in and called in the kids to check it out. They were impressed, but my daughter immediately spotted an issue. We'll be replacing this open fan with a smaller one where the blades are actually enclosed for a safe measure, and I would highly recommend that if you do a loft bed or a bunk bed. And the height that we chose for our bed was based on our 8-foot ceilings and wanting to be able to sit up in the bed with our son to do some reading. We did add LED lights underneath the bed for a little extra cool factor and some light under there while he's reading underneath. Our son loves it, but now his sister wants to ditch her day bed and get a loft bed too. If you want to see some more furniture projects, I got a playlist queued up for you right there. If you want the plans for this DIY loft bed, there's a link down below in the description. Go check that out. Until next time, guys, get out there and build something awesome.